Journalist turned investor, Sir Michael Moritz. He's represented Sequoia's investments in Yahoo, Google, LinkedIn, PayPal, and most recently, Instacart. Thanks.
Good morning. You can tell we're sitting right here in the center of the world of technology because this little clicker doesn't work wirelessly. It's connected to a bell and then to a light, and there's a gentleman that actually moves the slides along. So here we are right in the center of the technology universe. Thank you very much for having Sequoia here in the conference this morning. And I wanted to spend the next bit of time sharing some work that all of us at Sequoia have done over the last year or so, trying to distill our thoughts about where we're investing and how we're investing, and to share a few ideas with you that are still a little rough around the edges, but I hope will give everybody the sense that right here between San Francisco and San Jose, something utterly remarkable has been going on, is going on, and will go on. Something that really has only occurred in one or two other places in the whole course of human history. And to begin, I'd like to go back and give you a snapshot of life as it was in 1750, and take a close look at the slide just for a couple of reasons. One, this farmer with his plow, his most important tool, in 1750 wasn't living all that differently from other farmers 2,000 years before. He was aiming for self-sustenance for his family and a few close relatives and friends. He didn't think much about selling his produce. He was disconnected from consumers, and the idea about going to an organized workplace would not have crossed his mind. About that time, in a very small portion, about as small as Silicon Valley is, of the northwest of England, the first phase of the Industrial Revolution began. And take a look at this slide, and here you'll see a very dramatic change in the organization of the workplace. The centralization of tools that lay at the heart, the loom, of the evolution of the textile industry that changed everything. And instead of the farmer working in the fields, people for the very first time were organized in a workplace and in a factory. And the factory had a set of suppliers, and the products were made for consumers, and a whole raft of communication and distribution facilities were installed to help these businesses come about. But the big change was the move to an organized workplace. Now, the second phase of the Industrial Revolution occurred here in America. Again, in a very, or most of it, again in a very confined place, around Detroit and largely around Pittsburgh, but in the Northeast, in a confined geography, much like Silicon Valley is today. And if you look at the organization of the workplace, it didn't change very much between 1750 and the early textile mills and the growth of the steel mills and later the growth of the automobile factories. Again, what I suppose people call blue-collar workers went to work in those factories, and then over time a lot of white-collar jobs were created in and around those factories. But the factory itself was also isolated from consumers. There were multiple distribution channels between the factory and the consumers, and the feedback between consumers and the factory was, to say the least, very lengthy. Now that's just as much history as I'm going to bore you with this morning, but I wanted to go down memory lane because I think it's going to accentuate something that, for lack of a better phrase, at Sequoia we call the data factory. And I want to spend a couple of minutes explaining the powers that have enabled the enormous rise of the data factory in the last 10 years. So, a few quick thoughts. First, the explosion of bandwidth. And the change here has been unlike anything anyone has ever seen before in any comparable period of time between over the last 25 years. The second is in storage. It's hard for us to imagine today that about 14% of stored information in the world in 1986 existed, believe it or not, on vinyl records. And then we all know what's happened to the power of computers and computation, and I'm going to show you an example in a moment that further illustrates that. 25 years ago, most of the computing power in the universe was still, believe it or not, in a pocket calculator. And obviously that has shifted dramatically as the years have gone by. And finally, the other thing that has helped change everything for consumers and workers everywhere, and in particular these data factories, is the absolute massive explosion in applications in the last 40 years. Hard for us to conceive today when we have, as you see on the right, millions now of apps available on a little device, that just 40 years ago there were barely 200 computer applications running on the most popular set of computers in the world. And this is the final real idea about what's happened. Think back to the loom, think back to the assembly line and the tools in the automobile factory. What has happened to the cost and dispersion and distribution of tools in the last 2 decades? There has never been anything like it ever in human history. Imagine, it's 1973 and the Samsung or the Apple iPhone, the Samsung Android or the Apple iPhone that you hold in your hand, the equivalent cost of that computing power would have, was about $33 million. And bear in mind, those IBM computers didn't have cameras, they didn't have video, they didn't have audio, they didn't have accelerometers, they didn't have GPS. Never before have human beings been furnished with tools as powerful as the smartphones that we're all able to buy at the drop of a hat today. And the other thing that I'd like to put in perspective is the enormous explosion in the size of these tools. The numbers that you see on the slide illustrate in the first 3 columns the peak production anywhere in the peak production in the US of automobiles that peaked in the early 90s at just over 15 million, washing machines that changed lives, have changed lives over the last 100 years for everybody in homes and apartments, that peaked at 17 million. And this year, around 700 million, $33 million computing facilities will be put in the hands of people all around the world. There has never been anything like it. The other thing that's changed, particularly if you're a small business, particularly if you're an individual looking to set up a small business, is what's happened to the price of all the other tools that you need to operate your business. And look at the left-hand side of the slide and imagine what all of these things cost 10 years ago, let alone 20 years ago. And today, most of these functions are free or very close to free or can be rented by the city. And the same goes for the different functions that you need to operate, whether it's in a big company or a small company. The services that either were unavailable or you paid an arm and a leg for a decade ago, again, are verging to free. So you might well ask at this juncture, what does all this mean? And I think the changes actually are extremely profound, and it's given rise to something that at Sequoia, for, as I said, a lack of a better phrase, we call the data factory. And let me explain the composition. You'll look at the next few slides and say, well, I can think of other names that should be on these slides, and you're right, but I just wanted to offer you some broad brushstrokes of how we think about it. There are companies that specialize in the matching of labor, LinkedIn obviously being the largest there, but then there are a lot of other specialty companies that operate in the center matching demand and supply. There are a variety of companies that do the same for the movement and the raising of money, ranging from a company like Kickstarter and companies like Kickstarter and Indiegogo that have helped a lot with unconventional money raising, to companies that aren't on this slide, like PayPal and Klarna and Stripe. But the center, the largest and emerging category of companies in these data factories are the real global data factories. And what differentiates them from some of these other companies is the range and the extent of the tools, think back to the loom, think back to the auto factory, that they furnish tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of people around the world with. This has never happened before, and it's changing the complexion of our entire lives, starting with the workplace. This is our crude representation of a data factory. You'll notice one thing straight away. It has far fewer employees and workers than some of the other examples I gave you earlier. You'll also notice that here, and this is an attempt to characterize tools supplied by the data factories, companies like Google and Amazon and LinkedIn and others, tools that allow people to contribute and to enrich in the data factory without the data factory having to pay for anything. And the data factory sits in the middle, far more closely connected to consumers than any automobile factory or textile mill ever was, directly connected to these consumers, who in turn provide immediate and rich feedback, and it's all maneuvered and massaged by these central data factories. And I'm going to spend the next few minutes explaining some of the implications of all of this. But here I'm trying to get across the notion that the data factory benefits from unpaid contributions from lots of people. And here, to give the sense that the data factory is actually selling a whole bunch of services that, most importantly, allow the purchasers of those services to make money for themselves. But you can see now how powerful the position of these data factories is becoming. So here's one example, and this is the only example that I will give you of unpaid contributions, but think YouTube, think Yelp, think a whole bunch of other services, and it's the same precise thing. LinkedIn, about a year ago, started to beef up its content effort and invited different people around the world to contribute content, but these weren't ordinary people. Among the contributors are Bill Gates and the president, and other people like Jamie Dimon, head of JP Morgan. They are all contributing content to LinkedIn for free. The result has been that LinkedIn now ranks among one of the biggest business sites online in the world. And the result has been that LinkedIn's traffic on LinkedIn today has multiplied 8-fold thanks to a whole bunch of unpaid contributions. Now, more interestingly, I'd like to talk about what happens when tools are put in the hands of individuals. And I'm going to riffle through a whole bunch of slides really, really quickly to show this, starting with 3 or so examples, and I know you heard from the founder of Lyft earlier, of places that are really helping people who otherwise would be lost in the low-paid part of the American service economy. So here's what Uber has done for a fella named Sam Taylor. And here is Instacart, a local shopping service that started in San Francisco, where this college student is able to gain employment, make money, pay rent in a fashion that she wouldn't have been able to do before Instacart came along. And the same, as you know, is evident with TaskRabbit. Now, all of those examples are what I would think of as dollar per hour jobs, maybe $18 to $30 per hour. Here are some examples of what the tools that the data factories have put out to people all over the world. eBay, I'm going to start with a couple of the big examples and then work through to the small ones. eBay has enabled 25 million sellers around the world, including people like the fella pictured at the bottom of the slide, who now run multiple $million-dollar businesses that they couldn't have managed before eBay. Same thing for Google AdWords, which transformed a small little business called King Arthur Flour, thanks to the way in which AdWords enabled this little company in the Northeast to get business. Here's an example of YouTube. You probably all have heard from Michel Fan, gone from an unknown, but thanks to the power of the tools supplied by YouTube, the data factory, now has a thriving business and following of her own. But probably the biggest data factory in the world is Amazon. This fella here, Bryce, had a sled business that was on its back before Amazon came along, and he now sells more than 14,000 sleds a year as a small business, thanks to the Amazon tools all over the world. Kindle has put tools in the hands of authors that have transformed their business. It's allowed the authors to get paid far more quickly than they would have done yesteryear. And in the course of perhaps 60 months, since the inception of Kindle and KDP, Kindle Direct Publishing, there'd been a whole bunch of million title sellers and people making a thriving income, far more income than they could have done in their previous life as normal writers. And Amazon Web Services, here's a slightly different example, but it's the same theme, taking Pinterest from this tiny little service to 17 million people, users in 9 months, with fewer than 12 people at the heart. A few other very quick examples. There's a lady called Carrie who uses a service called Weebly. And thanks to Weebly, she now distributes products all over the world. The tools didn't exist 15 years ago. Airbnb, 150,000 room nights a year are booked on Airbnb, and people are making significant amounts of money thanks to Airbnb. People are paying their mortgages, they're helping putting kids through school, etc., etc. Again, the tools did not exist, and Airbnb, this new data factory, is enabling a lot of that. Trulia, this lady, had a very small real estate business in San Diego before the advent of Trulia. Trulia, thanks to the services it provides her, has allowed her not only to transform a business, but also to buy a business. This lady is in Canada. House is in Palo Alto. This lady here now has business all over the world, thanks to the services that House provides. Here, there's an example from Square. There's a company that makes bracelets in I think, Costa Rica, that employs college students, or contracts with college students all over the country, who can sell these bracelets and provide income for people in Costa Rica thanks to the Square service. And two final examples, and then I will begin to wrap up really quickly. Unity does something very similar for the whole ecosystem of video developers, and I expect you all know about the examples of people, individuals who've been able to build businesses thanks to Etsy. What does all this mean? It means life is very tough for most everybody in America. It means life is very tough if you're poor. It means life is very tough if you're middle class. It means that you have to have the right education to go work at a place like the companies on the right-hand slide. Walmart employs 2.2 million people. Google employs 40,000. General Motors at its peak used to employ 700,000 people. Today, Apple, including retail, employs 80,000 people. If you're not like us, it's tough. Here's what the median household income in America has done over the last 40 years. It is brutal. Here's what's happened to the minimum wage in America over the last half a century. It is brutal. We are very lucky here. We are extremely fortunate, and we belong in a real small minority. And despite all this explosion of tools, it hasn't had much of an effect on GDP, despite the fact that 20 million businesses in America are self-employed businesses, despite the fact that about 30% of Americans now work by themselves, thanks to a lot of the tools that I have just mentioned. But it hasn't had much of an effect on gross GDP for two reasons. One, because of the decline of manufacturing in America, and the second is because of the difficulty, or another big part of the reason is the difficulty that we have had attracting talent to America and keeping them in America. And these are the numbers of H-1B visas that were granted in 2011. 600 or so to people from Spain, when there are thousands of people who would be qualified to come work and help the personal revolution on its way. But the most important thing, and the reason that it has yet to bring the benefits to America that we've talked about with those earlier revolutions, is that this is the first shift in industrial and technology revolution, that has occurred simultaneously around the world. Textile mills were centered, as I said, in the middle part of England, the automobile factories in a small part of America. The internet, the explosion of these data factories is occurring all over the world. And though I've given you all this morning American examples of these companies, the same thing is happening in different geographies, most noticeably in China, where companies like Alibaba and Tencent and Baidu are doing very similar things for their marketplace that the American companies are doing today. So, and today, more than half of the most valuable internet companies in the world are not in the United States. That has never been true for the emergence of a huge, abrupt shift in the organization of human work that has never occurred in human history before. I see my time is up. You now all have a caffeine break, and appreciate very much being here on behalf of Sequoia. Thank you.